So introduction to backend development. So understanding the backend. So backend is basically the server side of application and which do the application logics and database related things. So it responsible for processing requests and implementing business logic and managing data storage and retrieval. So we can categorize things as client, server, and database. So client is the thing that we use as interfaces. So and server is the component that do the server side, which means business logic related things, as I mentioned earlier. So database store the data and things. So client send some request to the server and server do the logic and it can save data in the database and get data from the database and it sends the response back to the client. Then client show the relevant data in the UI. So and important of the backend in the application. So data management, business logic implementation, security and authentication, performance optimization. I think you guys already know the importance of backend and connecting backend and frontend. So as I mentioned earlier, the client server and database act like this. So client send a request to the server and server do the some action and it returns back to the client as a response. So the request and response is some calls. So which means communication. So we need a some methods to do the communication. So there are different types of communication method: HTTP, HTTPS protocol, WebSocket, gRPC, MQTT, AMQP, FTP, SMTP, SOAP, and many more. So in this session, we are mainly focusing about the HTTP, HTTPS protocol, which means in using that REST API. And yes, so what is API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface, so which act as a bridge between the front end and back end. So according to that definition, API is a set of rule and protocol that allow different software application to communicate with each other. So and for example, I want to know about the weather. So I go to the website, uh, something called weather application, and then I check the weather. So then the front end send a request to the backend and backend do the processing and send the response back to the UI. Then UI show the that weather data. So those requests are API calls. So yes, and REST, representational state transfer. So REST use HTTP protocols. So there are some protocols: get, post, patch, and delete. So if we are sending a get request, which means we request some data from the server, and post mean we are sending some data. For example, we want to save a user, so we send a post request with that user data. So then server can save those data in the database. So patch means we are updating something in the database, and delete means we are deleting something in the database. So any related any delete related logic. So for that purposes, use we use that get, post, patch, and delete methods, HTTP method. So in this diagram, we can see how things work. So each time we send a JSON in HTTP, in REST, we use JSON. So we send JSON as the request body, as well as we get a JSON response to the client. So yes, and advantages of backend development. So scalability, maintainability, security, and integration. So we have a clean code base with so database related activities. So then things are easy to manage and easy to scale. Also, we can protect sensitive data, and yes, and also it's easy to integrate with third-party services and APIs. So yes, here are some advantage of backend development. And so here we are. Now we are going to learn about the Spring Boot. So before learning Spring Boot, I think it's better to learn about the history, how the Spring Boot evolved and how the Java backend development evolved. So the current trend is Spring Boot. Also, there are some different type of frameworks. And yes, so history and evolution of Spring framework and Spring Boot. So in the early ages, so Java started as a language for building like small application, right? So when we want to do something like database related thing, security thing, or anything, so we have to implement everything from scratch, right? So there isn't any predefined thing. So therefore, the early ages, the developers has to write everything from scratch, which take time, and it's so much pain. So, and it's very hard to develop large scale application. So as a solution for that problem, so Java E, which is Java Enterprise Edition, came. So I told you guys about in the Java is in the early ages we have to do the things manually. So in Java E introduced to help developers to build enterprise apps and more easily, and provided standard APIs for handling security, database connection, and transition. So it came with some default things I mean which help us to do the things easily. So there are some key features in Java EE. So EJB, JDBC, and Servlet. So EJB basically stands for Enterprise Java Beans, and which handles the business logic, and JDBC mean manage database connection. Also, Servlet and JSP used for building dynamic web application. So I think when I'm in third year, second semester, or something, we learned about those things. So I think you guys also can learn those things if the syllabus not changed. I think, yeah. So if you guys are really interested about those things, yeah. So there are many resources that you guys can learn, and yes. So there was some problem with Java EE. So it's simplify that initial problems which Java had, but it's too complex to configurations. Like it use XML to do the configuration, and it takes so much time to do the configuration, and there are so many boilerplates, which means we need to write same code again and again, and it's very hard to test. So therefore, there are some drawbacks in Java EE as well. So as a solution for that, in 2003, Spring Framework came to the picture. So Roderick Johnson created the Spring Framework, and the purpose of the Spring is to simplify the Java enterprise application development. So there are some key concepts of Spring Boot framework and dependency injection, aspect-oriented programming, and Spring MVC. So there are many more. So we learn about the creating objects. So we in the previously, like when we are doing the Java basics in this section, we created the objects manually, right? So when we are developing the application, it's really hard to manage those objects manually. So as a solution for that, so dependency injection so came to the picture. So which automatically handle object creation and making the code easier to manage. So and aspect oriented programming and Spring MVC. So Spring MVC simplifies the web development by separating model view and control architecture. So model view, model mean data which are database related things, and UI mean so user interface, we can say. View mean user interface, and controller means the place where business logic handles. So the dependency injection is something important for us in the Spring Boot. So therefore, uh, dependency injection is a way to provide objects to a class. So to a class without the class creating them itself. So, and I told you guys about that object creation. So we have to do the things manually, but uh, the dependency injection automatically get the do that object managing part. So to do that, to create an object, so
Hello. Hit
so
in the mode.
for a, for example, let's say public class product service. So forget about these things. Those things are annotations. So we have a class called product service, and inside that we have another class called product repository, right? So if we want to use that product repository, we have to create an object in the this class. So instead of creating an object, so we have an annotation called auto while. So when we initialize this uh, object using that auto while annotation, so Spring automatically inject the uh, product repository object here. So then we no need to worry about creating object and things. So simply we can call the uh, object methods belongs to that object. So it makes your code simpler and easy to change and test the things. And also there are some limitations of Spring framework. So heavy configurations, and it's Spring also use some XML files for configuration and manual setup. So we have to configure things like beans and components. So also there are some boilerplates as well. So we have to write the same code again and again. Also, we need to take care of the database connection and web server configurations. So as a as the solution for that problem, so the Spring Boot came to the picture, and the birth of Spring Boot happened in 2014. So it solved the complexity of the Spring framework, and there are some key features like auto configuration, embedded server, start pumps. So we no need to do the configurations manually. So Spring automatically do the majority of them. Also, we can customize. So as a beginners, it's very easy to us. So because there are no configuration. So embedded server means so we need a server to run our application. So in previously we need to install a server and configure the things. So in the Spring Boot, it comes with the server. So we no need to worry about configuring servers and things. Yeah. So start pumps mean so in Java. So I told you guys. So in early ages, we wrote everything from scratch, right? So there are some common scenarios that we no need to write same thing again and again, right? For creating database connection and many things. So for that purposes, many developers have wrote the codes and they have published in a one place. So then we can reuse that code bases, right? So those things are known as dependencies. So we can use those dependencies in our application, and then we no need to write the same code again and again. We can use a already written code that do the job for us. Yeah. So start from which contain the dependencies and project related all the information, and it's very easy to manage the project related things. Yeah. So there are So as I mentioned earlier, there are some core features: auto configuration, startup home, and embedded server. And so setting up a Spring Boot uh, project. So for that you need to install Java. So and also you need a project, and also you need a application development environment like IntelliJ. So and also you guys can use Visual Studio and Eclipse, and there are many more IDEs. So I prefer IntelliJ over other tools. So so how to create a simple Spring Boot project? So Spring Boot uses there's a tool called Spring Boot Initializer. By using that, we can easily create a Spring Boot project. So I told you guys about the dependencies. So for the creating a Spring Boot application, so also known as Java Persistence API, so which help us to do the database related activities like do the interactions with the database. Also the MySQL connector. So if we are working with MySQL, we need to establish the connection between the MySQL server and our backend. For that purpose, we can use the MySQL connector as a dependency. So I will go to the this page. So I think you guys can see the screen, right? So can someone raise the hand if you guys can see the screen? So this website start.spring.io. Nice, cool, thank you. So in the this screen, so there are some sections: project, Spring Boot, project metadata, Java, and dependencies. So in here we can see there are so many dependencies. We can use them to do the things for ourselves without implementing them from scratch. So there's a project, Maven and Gradle. Those things are manage the project. So basically, uh, Maven and Gradle used to manage dependencies, compile the code, run the test, and build the application, and many things. So Gradle is faster than Maven, but I'm familiar with Maven, so therefore I'm going with Maven. So there are three languages, so we can create a Spring Boot application using Java, Kotlin, or Groovy. So we will go with Java, and here's the Spring Boot version. So 3.3.4 is the most stable one, and project metadata we can change those things. So I keep everything same as it is. So here dependencies. So since we are creating a Spring Boot, so REST API, so REST application, so we have to add this Spring Web dependency, right? So once we add the Spring Web, so our application will act as a so Spring Web. So it's easy to build a REST API. So here we can see a simple small description: build web including RESTful application using Spring MVC, uses Apache Tomcat as the default embedded container. So I told you guys, so Spring Boot come with default server. So when we add Spring Web, we can get the Tomcat server. So yes, so here we can explore the project. So project folder structure look like this, and this is the pom.xml file. So here we can see the dependencies that we have added. So we have added Spring Boot start web dependency since we are creating the RESTful API. Also inside the source main Java com example demo. So here's the main method. So in every Java application there's a main method. So same applies here. So here we have the main application main method here. So we can run the main method, then the Spring Boot application will start. So and there's a folder called resources and which contain application.properties file, and where we can write the basic configuration things like if we want to connect to a database, then we can add the database URL and database server username, password, and those related things. And here test, we have, it comes with by default test folder, so we can write test as well. So, and yes, so these are folders in the Java world. These things are known as packages. So yes, so in it simply we can download the application like this, and it download as a zip file. So yes, so before going to that downloaded zip file, so we need to know few things, few annotations in Spring Boot. So there are some annotations so which simplify the process for us. So you guys saw in the main method there's a annotation called Spring Boot application, so which marks the main class of a Spring Boot application and which combines with configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. If you guys are interested in, so you guys can search more about this annotation, configuration, and auto configuration and component scan. So there are a lot of uh, annotations so which simplify the coding process. Also the REST controller, so and which combine control and response body. So I told you guys we have front end, which means client and server. So client send a request to the server, and we which is a HTTPS request, since we are talking about that REST APIs. So we need a way to listen to that, and when we uh, annotate a class using that REST controller, which act as a endpoint. So for example, uh, so I have a product class and I annotate it using that REST controller. So if we want to create a product, so from front end, which means client, we send a request to the server, then it comes to that product endpoint. Yeah. So for that, so for send a request, we need a address, right? So I in my home I have an address, and if you guys want to send something to me, so you guys can use that address, right? Likewise, we need to uh, add an address to that product controller, product class, right? Which means REST controller. So for that purpose, we can use request mapping. So we can map the that product class. We can give an address to it. So then the client can easily send a request to that address. So also there are, I mentioned you guys about that HTTP methods, get, post, patch, and delete to define a get endpoint. So get address. So we can use that get mapping, also post mapping, and there are patch and delete mapping. So by using these three annotation, we can simplify the routing and request handling process. So also there's another annotation called entity. So we can later discuss uh, it for more. So you guys know about we have database. I assume you guys have a basic idea about MySQL database. So MySQL database has table. So in the database we have table. In the code base we need to map that table related data to a class. For that purpose, we create a specific class and we annotate it using entity. So in the Java project, so our table is that entity class. in the database, we have a separate table for that. So yes, so before going to database, so I will open that downloaded Spring project, and in the IntelliJ from by using the IntelliJ, and I will show you guys about the things that I mentioned in the earliest slides about those annotation and things. So give me a second, I will open the project in the IntelliJ. Yeah, here we go. So I opened the project. So here we have the POM. So we can see the Spring Start web, and we have some files. So source, inside the source we write the everything. So there's a two packages called main and test. Inside test we write the test, and I told you guys about. So we have resources, so application properties, and this is our main class. So we can run this main method. So by default, the Tomcat server start on port 8080. So let me create a sample endpoint. So using that REST controller and request mapping. So those endpoints, so those entry points are called as controller. So when client send a request to the backend, those requests come to that entry point, then it handle the business logic and send the response to the client. So as I mentioned earlier, so I create a package. So as a practice, it's better to have separate packages for controller, entity, and handle the business logics. So I create a package called controller. Inside that, I will create a controller called hello controller. So right, so I told you guys about. So if we want to create an entry point for our server, we have to annotate that class using REST controller. So I create the REST controller. So now the hello controller acts as a entry point. So front end can send a request and get a response uh, from our server. So also I need a I need to define a route, right? I need to give an address for that hello controller. So for that purpose, we can use that request mapping annotation. So I used this uh, entry point address as hello. So then, and the hello, we need to get hello world once we trigger to that entry point. For that, I create a endpoint. Uh, I annotate the I will create a method, and I will annotate it as a get mapping. So once we send a get request to the backend, so it returns the hello. So yes, hello world. So by default, we no need to add route inside here. So it by default it takes like this. So let's say we have multiple methods for that get. Say hello or something. Then the when once we send a request, the server will be confused because there are same address. So therefore, if we are using many get mappings. So we have to uh, define the path inside this get mapping like this. So I will hello 2 or something. So I will edit like this and I will run the application. So I created the an REST API. So as you guys can see, we didn't take more than 5 minutes to create that API. So in early ages, it took hours and hours to create a API. So I will call this endpoint here. So I told you guys about that our application is running on port 8080 in our local host. So we can access our endpoint like this. So here we can see the response. For we called that hello endpoint and it returns the hello world. So then we have another get endpoint which called hello 2. So once we hit that endpoint, so it returns the hello world 2. So yes, so let's go back to the slides and let's move to the databases. Yes. So databases. So as you guys know, database used to store data and organize those data. So we can connect Java to the database to save, retrieve, and update application data. So how Spring Boot helps? So Spring Boot simplifies the database interaction by managing the connectivity for you. So we no need to write the database connection for ourselves. So I told you guys about that application.properties file. So what we have to do is we can we can add the database URL, server name, and those things. Then Spring Boot automatically connect to the database. So we no need to worry about that establishing database connection. Yes. So when we talk about databases and Java, so there's a special thing called JPA. So JPA stands for Java Persistence API. So I told you guys about that in the early slides as well. So it's standard specification for managing relational data in the Java application. So we no need to write the SQL queries and things. So we can treat things as class and object. So JPA convert those things to SQL queries and JPA handle everything related to that SQL thing. So we no need to write SQL queries. So therefore it's very easy to do the basic operations using that JPA. So why use JPA? So it simplifies database interaction by automatically generating SQL queries and focus on managing Java objects, and JPA handles the database side, which means JPA handles the database queries and those things. So to configure the MySQL database, so in this section, in this database section, we are going with MySQL. So if you guys can connect many databases, so there are many databases like MongoDB, graph databases like Neo4j, and many more. So each database has their own packages. I mean dependencies. We can add them and we can do the configuration in the properties file. Then we can connect to the database. So JP, so Java JPA automatically connect to the database. Yeah. So for that, to connect to the database, MySQL connector need. So to establish the connection, and we need data JPA for that, do the SQL related activities using that Java classes. So I told you guys about that application properties. So we need to configure the database, and for that purpose we need to give the URL of our database server and username, password, and driver. So those things are like constant, which will not change. So when we create a connection, if you have a local server, so basically you have to change your database name only, right? And you have to change the username and password once you add it when you install in the MySQL server. So and we need to define the driver class, so it's also a constant, so no need to change. So there are some JPA related settings. So I told you guys about that we have entity in our code base, which is a class, and in the database we have table. So once we made a change to our entity, we need to do the changes for the database table as well. So we no need to do this. So JPA will handle this. For that, we have to do the only change is JPA dot spring dot JPA dot hibernate dot DDL auto equal enable. We have to tell so JPA to update the changes automatically. Then JPA will update all the table changes automatically. So yes. So here's a example of entity. So entity is a database table. So in the database we have table. In the code base we have entity. So entity and table are same. So so we have a class called product, and we need to make it as an entity. For that purpose, we can use that entity annotation uh, in the product class. So also as example, as a SLIT student, we have a student ID. So which used to uniquely identify a student. In the same applies to the database tables. So we have many records and we need a way to uniquely identify a row. For that purpose, we use a name called primary key. So basically we create a ID, then we assign and we tell ID to act as a primary key. So for that, we can use that ID annotation. So ID annotation means which specifies the primary key, also generated values. So and there are some many strategies. So for example, our student ID number start with IT21 like this. So when we use generated value strategy, generated type identity, so which means the how we define our primary key. So the database has inbuilt in auto increment feature. So when we use that annotation, so database will do the uh, ID handling part automatically. So if we add a record first time, so the ID will be 1. So then we add a new record again. So the second record ID will be 2. Likewise, it will automatically increment the uh, primary key value. So I told you guys about JPA, and I also mentioned about the repository. So JPA is a interface. It has predefined methods, and we can use them to do the database related operation. So we no need to write our own SQL queries and related things. So JPA content like get all items from the table, which means select all from table name and find by ID. So where which means select all from the table where ID equal some ID. So those type of basic uh, operations are in the JPA repository. So for the we have a now we have a table called product in our database. So for map that table, we have an entity in our code base, which is product entity. So we need to do the database related operations to that product entity. For that purpose, we need a repository. So we define, so we can create a class to do the database related operations. So these type of class we define as a repository. So as a practice, we use the entity name, then repository. So our entity is product, then product repository, which is a interface. So public interface, public repository, which extends by using that JPA repository. So we need to pass our entity and primary key type, right? In our example, our primary key is ID, the type is long. So therefore, we pass the long as the primary key type. So now we have a product repository. By using that product repository, we can do the database related operations. So let's do something with that database and CRUD related operation. So I will open this project, and I told you guys about the MySQL and JPA. So I will go to add dependency. Oh, we can also do Google and get the dependencies to our application and add it to the POM file. So it's easy to do the search from there. So we need to connect our database, our application to MySQL database. For that, we need MySQL connector, so MySQL driver, and we need JPA. So I told you guys about that setters and getters, right? So we have a class and which has 5 attributes. So if we want to get those attributes and we want to set some values to those attributes, we have to write some setters and getters. As a solution for that, there's a package called Lombok. So Java annotation library which helps to reduce boilerplate code. So by using that, there are some annotations. So by using that, we just only have to annotate our class uh, using their Lombok annotation. So there are some annotations, setters and getters. Then we no need to write about those setters and getters manually. So I will show these things in a while. So here you can see the dependencies that we have added. Connector J, we want Lombok, and I will copy the whole the dependencies. So, and I will go to our project. We have the form.xml file where our dependencies manage. So I copy everything there, and so I have added the packages. So now we have to sync, right? We have added new packages. So then we need to download those packages. For that purposes, we have Maven and Gradle, I told you. So in here we can see a load Maven changes button. So once we click this, the Maven automatically download these packages for us. Then we can use those things in our application. So yes. So now I will run the application, and we added that database related packages. Therefore, we will get a error. So fail to configure a data source URL, attribute is not specified, blah blah blah. So we added the MySQL connection package and JPA package. So therefore, the Spring Boot application look into a database connection. So we haven't configured it. So therefore, we have to configure it. So I will configure it and rerun the application. So I need a database to do the demo. I create a new database, create database name spring spring, and I will run the application. So I just forgot to tell you guys about the MySQL. So MySQL just a MySQL server. So you guys need to visit that site and download the MySQL server and MySQL Workbench. So MySQL Workbench is the user interface and MySQL server is the server. So by using that UI, we can do the database relation related operations. So yes, and if you guys haven't installed MySQL, and you guys can install using that site. So let's go back to the application. So we created our database, and we can see our database. We don't have any tables here. Uh, right. So now we have to configure the uh, database URL. So I told you guys it's a constant. So which is JDBC MySQL colon forward slash localhost. The MySQL service running on port 3306, and our database is Spring. And then I need to configure username and password for the SQL server. So my username is root. So when I installed in the SQL server, I configured the username as root, and my password is root at 123. So here are the uh, MySQL connection settings. So now we need to create that JPA settings. So we need to configure the dialect spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.dialect, which is org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect. So then we need to say Spring to update our entities automatically in the database. So jpa.hibernate.ddl auto. There are different types of values. So I'm using that update. I want to update the database once I do a change for a entity. So spring.jpa.show SQL true, which means I told you guys about we no need to write about the SQL queries. JPA handle those things. So we called a object method. We called a method. Then JPA do the SQL part, and we need to see the SQL query what happened. So once we call find by ID, what's the SQL query? For that purpose, we can add JPA show SQL equal true. Then JPA will show the SQL query once JPA execute a SQL related method. So let me run the application. Yes, now I connected to the application. So I made a database connection successfully. So let's create a model entity called product. So I told you guys about as a practice, we separate each things two packages. So I create a package called entity. So inside the entity, I create a class called product, and we need to annotate this product as entity, which means we need to tell this product class to you are a table, you need to act as a table, then we therefore we use that entity. So and we need to set and get uh, product related attributes. So therefore instead of writing setters and getters, I use that Lombok annotation, so I don't need to worry about those things. So then I need a primary key, so I added at id annotation, so which act as a primary key. Then I want to generate primary key automatically. For that, generate value, and I want to select a strategy. I want to generate is automatically by default from the database, and I create the database, and I need name for the product, and I need description for the product, and I need price for the product. Yes. So this is my entity. So let's go to the our database, and we don't have any table. So I will run the application, and JPA will automatically create the uh, database table for us using that entity annotation. So once we run the application, we need to enable annotation processing, because Lombok need to do, like, we need to give the permission likewise. And let's refresh the uh, data. So this yes, I forgot. So when we add a new record, so JPA will automatically create a table, I think. Yeah. Uh, so yes. So yes. So once we created that en entity, so which means database table in our code base. So now we need to uh, create a product for our system. So for that, we need to define a controller, which means endpoint. So I name this controller as product controller. So I need to say this class to act as a REST controller. So I annotate using REST controller. Now this product controller is a REST API. So and I give it a address. So like product, and yes. So public string test product. So we have to map it, git mapping. We will return string test, and we will let's run the application and check we can access, we can get test from calling that product endpoint. So here we have to call product. Yes, we can see we have successfully created that product get product endpoint. So we can't get any product because we don't have anything. For that purpose, let's create a product using that request mapping. So now we know we have controller and repository. So let's create that repository. Since I told you guys about the naming convention for the repository, which means when we are doing the database related activities, we need a repository. So we need that class using that repository keyword and entity name plus repository. To store the repositories, I create a package called repository. Also, we can write our business logic inside that controller endpoint. As well, we can move that logic to another class called service class. So then controller class front end send a request to the controller endpoint. So controller endpoint call the service method. In the service method, we write all the business logic. So service method call the database and related things and many things. So as a practice, let's create a service package and let's create service class called product service. So since this is a service class, we need to annotate it using that service annotation. So let's create the product repository. So which is an interface, and we need to implement. So we need to annotate it using that repository. So we need to extend this using that JP repository. So yes, so we give the our entity class here and the return type. So now using that product repository, we can do the basic CRUD related operations. So for the product controller, now we are going to create a product. And I told you guys about that service things. We are implement our business logic inside the service class. So, and we need to, once we are implementing our business logic, we need to use that repository. So for that purpose, we need to create an object for repository. So we are not going to do this manually. So we use that theory called dependency injection. So using that auto wire, I create the repository object. I inject the product repository inside this product service. So I create the product repository. So public void create product. So we need to create product. So when we send a request from client to server, we need to send basic details of the product like product name, price, and description. For that purpose, we can create another package called a payload. So and inside this, so I create a class called product request DTO. DTO means data transmission object. So when we are transferring data between our application, so we create DTO. So DTO is nothing complex. It's just a class. So we use getter and setter right there, and we need private uh, string name, private string description, private double price for our product, right? So now we create a payload, which means request body. So once front end uh, call to the our post endpoint and it sends some data in the request body. So since the data coming from the request body, we have to annotate request body, and then we need to give about that class, which is product request DTO, which means the user the send a request to the this product create endpoint with using that name, description, and price. So yes, now we got the product request DTO. Then we need to, so here as well, I need to create object for product service. So which means do the dependency injection. And I told you we call the controller, then controller call to the service method do the business logic. Therefore, I added the product service right there, and product service dot create product, and we are send product request DTO. So since we are getting the product request DTO, I have to change the method signature. So and so once we create a product, we need to pass the response back to the client. For that purpose, I create another class called product response DTO. I also add getter and setter right there. And here now we have a private uh, uh, ID and name, description, and private double price, right? So if we want to, if we don't want to send price, so then we can remove the price from the response DTO. So basically, response DTO is about this. If we want to send all the details, we can all the things. If we don't want to send all the things, we only need to send some specific things. For that purposes, we can create and response DTOs and do the job for us. So here I will go to the create product, and here we return product response DTO. So now we got the product request DTO. If we want, we can do some validations like product name only can contain strings. So these kind of validations we can do inside here. So I'm not going to do any kind of things right there. So basically, I'm going to save the product inside the database. For that, we have a entity called product. So to save, we create a repository, right? So repository accepts only product. So in the when we create repository, so we define the product repository using that product, which means uh, we need to pass a product when we are saving the data. Also, we get a product when we are getting some data from the database. So we create a product and new product. I create a product object right there, and I'm going to set the product name and product price and product description, and I want to save. Now I want to save the product. So for that, there are for that we use product repository. So product repository contains many things like you can see delete by ID, save, delete, delete all, delete all by ID, find all. Likewise, there are so many predefined things. So we just have to call the required method, then JPA take care of that SQL query part. So we no need to worry about that SQL query implementation. So product. So I saved this value to a new object called saved product right there, and I want to create the product response right there. So for that purpose, I create a response DTO object. I assigned ID, name, description, price, and description right there. Then I can return the product response DTO. So here also we have to change the return type. So product response DTO. Yes, so now we created our controller class, and let's give it a try by creating a product. So I already have created a request body. So this is the tool called Postman. So in the browser, we can only send get request only. If you want to send some post, put, patch, delete, and hard head options. So for that, we can, there are some tools called Postman and Insomnia and like many tools. So I'm using Postman. So you guys can also use that tool. So in here, we have, I have added the endpoint address. So there's a section called body in the section, and there's a radio button row, and we need to select the type as JSON because I told you guys in the rest we are dealing with JSON. So and this is the request body. So we send the this request body to the product endpoint. So I will send the request and I got an error. So what's the error? Spring product doesn't exist. I think something wrong with that application properties. Oh, so so I think something wrong with the this Spring database. Let me try with that test. So before this session, I created this table and database and tried it by myself. So yeah, now we can see. So something wrong with that creating the table. So I'm not going to debug that. So which will take the time. So since the test DB is working perfectly, I'm going with that. So here we can see that ID, name, pineapple, and sample description. So in the test database table, we can see the new item created with the ID. So now uh, let's create a endpoint to get product ID, get product. Yeah. For that, uh, we need to get a product ID, right? For that, we can use request body. Also, there is a thing called path variable. So path variable means, so we add product ID, uh, like this, and we use that path variable annotation and data type long product ID. Then we can send a value to the endpoint like this. So the endpoint look like this: localhost 808080 product. So we can pass any ID like this /ID, right? So path variable act like this. So I will quickly create that get endpoint get product by ID. So we need to create the method inside the service layer. So now we need to get the product from the database. So for that, we need to do some validation. Like for example, we can call the product repository and we can find it by ID using like this. But this there can be a record for the that particular ID, or there isn't any record. So we don't know about the whether the product ID is valid one or not. So for that purpose, there's a special uh, method class called optional, which means we can say data type. So inside the optional, we can add product, which means if the product is exists in the table, so it gets the product. Otherwise, it return a null. So by using that if uh, optional product dot is empty, we can basically say the product is valid or not. So if it's a invalid product, I will send a empty response for the product. Or if you guys are know about the exceptions, you guys can throw exception and handle those things using exceptions like 404 error. So product not does not found or anything. Like now, once we validate whether it's in there or not, we need to get the product like this optional dot get optional product dot get. So now we got the product from the database. Now I have to create the product response, and I set ID, set name, set price, set description, and I return the uh, product response to the controller class. Then controller class return it to the client side. So I will go to the postman and I will send a request. So we have a product for ID 3, I think. Yes, so we have a product. So we got that product for pineapple. Sample description price 290. And here I told you, so we enable that JPA show SQL true. So therefore we can see the SQL query likewise. But yes, so those ID and those values are not logging in the console. So we if we want to debug the SQL query, so we need to add those values manually by ourselves. Yes, and now we get a product. So we will get a invalid product. So therefore we get a empty. We get a response product response DTO without setting any values. Therefore all the values are null. For that, as I mentioned earlier, you guys can add a exception and throw. So then the HTTP status will be 404. I forgot to mention there are some HTTP statuses 200, 201, 500. 200 means okay, 201 means created, and 404 means not found, 500 means internal server error. Likewise, there are so many HTTP statuses, so you guys can use those status as well. So now we created the get product endpoint. So let's delete a product from our table. So here also we have to get the product ID to delete. So and the mapping is delete mapping, delete product, path variable, long product ID, return product service dot delete product, product ID. So I will create the method inside the service class, and we can also do the same validation likewise, or otherwise we can simply call product repository delete by ID, and like this. So yes, so if you guys want, like, if you guys want to save the deleted item, so you guys can do the same thing. Like you guys can do the validation like this, whether the identify whether the product is in the table or not. If it's not in the table, so you guys invalid product ID, you guys can throw a error. So likewise, if it's deleted, if you guys want to send the product response to the as a response, you can do the thick like. So I'm not waste your time to do that. So I will go. So this is a void method. So we don't have return type. So basically I run the application, and let's refresh the table, and there are two items. I will delete the record with ID 3. So here I have added a delete request. So I'm going to delete 3. So now I got the 200, which means success. So we can see the table. So we have deleted the item from our database. And yes, so the last one, which is update endpoint. So which means patch mapping. And here also we have to give a product ID. What is the product that we want to update, and public void. So path variable product ID. So since we are updating the product, we need to get the new values from our request DTO. For that, I'm going to get the product request DTO from request body. So product service and update product by ID something. I pass the product ID and product request DTO. So we have the method, and so without doing any validation, I will directly update. So we need to get the product for that particular ID. So this is not a good practice. So we need to check whether it's present or not. So since I'm passing the ID which exists in the database, therefore I'm not going to implement it. So basically we get the uh, value. So we need to check whether the product request ETO value is like get name not null. Then we set the product name. If the price not equal null, when we set the product price. So if the description is not null, then we set the product. So by using that product repository, I'm going to save the product from our database, right? So I'm not going to return the response. So since it takes some time to do, so you guys can do that implementation according to your requirements when you are developing the application. So I will run the application and I will go to the database, and so right there we have sample description, pineapple price 290 and ID is 4. I get the, now I have a patch request right there, and our product ID is 4. In the request body we need to pass the new value. For I will update the price. So I will send the request is success. So from right there we can see our value is updated to from 290 to 490. Yes. So uh, uh, that's all about the things that I want to mention. And let me share the slides again. So yes, and thank you guys, and it's all about the session. And if you have any question, you guys can reach me out. So I'm in LinkedIn, and you guys can drop me a message. So my handle is Sapumal W. Yeah, that's all about the session. So if you guys also, you guys can follow the our SESC from the Instagram.